Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. This is your host, Cristi Habermann. I'm having a little bit of difficulty getting started. I have started the podcast 3 times now. I'm hoping that this time will be the successful one. I am happy to report that I am now cancer-free. I finished my radiation treatment last week, so I am so excited about that. Tell everyone thank you for listening to my podcast. I thought maybe after such a personal disclosure that a lot of people would unfollow me. Thank you for sticking in with me. I thought I was coming to the end of what I had to say about grief until I was talking to some other people and I realized that my focus on the grief has mostly been myself and what I was experiencing. And I realized that there was a whole new realm of grief topics that we could talk about. Most common questions that I see people ask, especially when they're married and their child dies, does this mean I'm going to get divorced? I've heard that a lot of people get divorced when their child dies. I can tell you that mine did not end up in divorce, but we went through a very, very difficult time. And it was mostly due to differences in grieving. As I always do when I do these topics that I know a little bit about, but not enough to talk like I know what I'm talking about, I did some research. And I'm finding the same thing that I found when I was writing my book, which is there is not much research on the impacts of grief of losing a child. I found 2 studies on Google Scholar, and they were old. They were from 1998, and I found some from overseas. Finland, to be exact, was studying divorce and the death of a child. Well, Finland isn't exactly the United States. So I just did a regular Google search and I found from Compassionate Friends. And so what Compassionate Friends says is that 16% of people that have lost a child end up in divorce. And I am looking to see, and that was done in 2006. So there have been huge strides in people being educated about grief, frankly, due to social media, to podcasts like mine, grief on Instagram, grief on Facebook to a certain degree. That's definitely where it started, but I think it's moved over to Instagram now. People can go and get support there. So of those 16% that said, I got divorced after the death of my child, only half of those, well, less than half of those, said that they felt like the death was the cause. And so when you're worrying about after your child died, especially in the beginning, and you're worried if you're going to get divorced, try to put that aside and think about focusing on just surviving the grief, thinking about how you're going to cope with the grief. And I can tell you, for me, my grief was immediate. I was a lost soul for that first year, easily for the first 4 years. But I remember after the first 9 months, my husband sitting me down and saying, you have to pay attention to us. We are still here. We know that Christopher died, but you need to pay attention to us. And I just got mad. Oh, I got mad because I just felt at that moment like I felt like I wasn't understood. How can you say that to me when I lost something so precious and so dear to me? And looking back now, I can see that he just didn't get it. I got to put a disclaimer out there because Roger is a stepfather. And so I don't know if it's different when it's a biological father. I'm not sure about that. So I don't want anybody to think my experiences were the same. Another significant event that happened is me and my husband had gotten into a fight. And it was right around the 1-year anniversary. And he told me that he had been giving me my way for a year. And he was tired of it. And he wasn't going to do it anymore. And I was shocked because in my perception, we had been getting along for the first time in a lot of years. There was some significant conflict before Christopher died. We didn't talk very much. He said that he'd been acting, basically, that he wasn't being authentic to who he was. It destroyed me. I was so broken up because I felt lied to. I felt betrayed. Oh, it was awful. Later, as we talked it out, we came home and he just started, it had to have been after the anniversary date because he just started crying. And he says, "Why do I feel like he just died?" And it's a year later. And I said, "That's because you've bottled it up for a year." I don't know if he thought that he could, knuckle through it like he's a military man, so stoic, have no feelings. I don't know if he thought that would get him through, but for him, his grief didn't start until the second year. And I don't know if that's true of all males. I just know that it was true of him. When you and your spouse are sitting there and you're bickering back and forth and he just seems not to get it, maybe you need to talk about where he is in his grief process, and you need to evaluate where you are in your grief process so that you guys can come to an understanding of where are we. Now, and it's really difficult with people that don't talk, and this goes both ways. Some relationships, the man is the talker. Some relationships, the woman is a talker. And then there also are the people that withhold their feelings. Grief is not one of those times that you hold your feelings. You've got to be able to share how you feel. And it's hard because then you're vulnerable. But if you can't be vulnerable with your spouse, who can you be vulnerable with? It goes for both male and female. And sometimes one spouse feels like, I don't want to burden them. They have enough on their plate. But grief is shared. It's shared between couples. Some of the challenges that come with grief are the conflict and the anger. And this definitely came up in my relationship with my husband because there were a lot of things that were done over the years. I'd been married 20 years at that point, I think. I was blaming him for them. I was angry at him because I was like, if we had done this, this wouldn't have happened. If we had done that, this wouldn't happen. And I was angry at him for a very, very long time. I am talking years, that anger. And it resulted in conflict. Because when I became overwhelmed with it in my thoughts, I would yell at him for some incident that happened 10 years before that I didn't agree with him on how he handled it. And that if he had done that, maybe Christopher wouldn't have died. It made no sense. And then I remember one particular fight where he said to me, "Don't you think I have regrets too?" And I had to answer him honestly, no, I didn't think you had regrets. He's like, "Of course I have regrets. But I didn't know that. You didn't talk to me about that." So then we started talking about the things that we regretted. So I think the key here is sticking to it. That no matter how bad it gets, you have to stick to it and work through it. Now, what if your spouse is to blame? How do you handle that? You handle that through forgiveness. An example of this would be there's a car accident and your child dies, but your spouse doesn't, and your spouse is driving. Do you blame them? Absolutely. Because as parents, we're the ones that are supposed to protect our children. Do you blame yourself? Probably. But that's when you move towards self-forgiveness and forgiveness of the other person. Because the other person's probably blaming themselves too. I think in those situations that it's harder to navigate through those feelings when there's a perception of that the other person caused the death of your child. There's also different grieving styles. And that was definitely the case with me and my husband. I'm very out there with how I feel. In fact, one of the ways that I've handled my cancer at my work is I overshare. Because if I overshare, people quit asking you questions. And now I just get left alone. So it's pretty good. But all of my feelings are right out there with the world. So glad. My husband's are not. In fact, it was very difficult for him to acknowledge that he had feelings. But it was very necessary for his mental health to express the feelings. And he won't really talk to me about what changed to make him start expressing his feelings more. I am not sure. I do know that during this time, there was no thought of divorce. We just didn't have time for it. We were stuck in our grieving. And that's another thing that you need to think about when you are thinking about your fears about divorce. What was the relationship like before? Before the divorce? Were you connected to each other? Were you struggling? Was the spouse checked out? I seen a movie not that long ago about a lady. I thought it was incredibly selfish. Her child had died and she went to live in the woods, no survival gear, no nothing, to honor her child's death. Well, I don't think it's to honor. I think it was to atone. And so she was punishing herself, and that's what she did. But I gotta ask, what could you have possibly done that you need to punish yourself for? And I see it over and over and over again where people punish themselves because of various reasons. Now, I don't know very many people that do that with the grieving of a child, but as a therapist, I've seen it over and over and over again that people keep repeating self-defeating behaviors as punishment. So I think that's a factor in divorce also, is that one spouse or another says, it's my fault, so I can't be with this person anymore, so I don't hurt them anymore. There's all kinds of reasons why people get divorced, and they're not always about ill will. Sometimes it's about protection. They want to protect you from being hurt anymore. Or they want to protect you from having it not happen again. And so there's this self-punishment factor. And you got to be careful that you're not the one that's punishing the other person. Because I feel like sometimes with myself, when I would get mad at Roger, I was punishing him for these decisions he made that I didn't agree with and felt powerless about. It still burns me. I still get upset about it, but it's in the past. It can't be changed now. And then also another challenge is the difference in grieving. One of you might be very intense about your grieving, the other one may not. But also I feel like some of these are too simplistic because when I think about this, I think about acceptance. There's this expectation sometimes on many different things in relationships where people believe that you have to experience things the same level of intensity, same level of grief, that everything has to be the same. And if you're not doing it exactly their way, then it's not happening. I see that frequently in just regular relationships, is that if he loved me, he would do it this way. So be careful in your relationship not to be saying, if he loved me, he'd do it this way. Or if you don't see him grieving and you say, well, clearly he didn't love our child because he's not grieving like I'm grieving. He's not hurting like I'm hurting. That's not always the case because people deal with grief differently. And then some people are very cognitive about their grief, which is they're very in their head. So they may not have any emotional expression at all. I worry about those kind of people because then it builds up. And I'm one of those people that believes that emotions build up in our body and they cause disease. And so it's not uncommon after the death of a child for one to get a chronic illness just because of the stress of it. And so if there'd be one recommendation I would make would be to express your grief. Now, it doesn't have to be verbally. It can be through artwork. It can be through physical exercise. It can be through mental processing like journaling. But you need to work through the grief. It's just necessity. So let's talk about the positives. What increases your ability to maintain the relationship after the death of your child? One is the strength of your relationship. That's one of the things that Roger and I had in common. We'd been married for a long time. We were military. We didn't have family support. We only had each other when we were in the military. We didn't have much for friendships either. We, for a long time, only depended on each other. There were cracks in our relationship. Him getting out of the military was really difficult. Moving to South Dakota was really difficult for us. But in the end, we worked it out. But it's definitely strength of a relationship is a factor. So if your relationship is unsteady before the death of your child, or divorce was thought of before the death of your child, it may be that afterwards you might get divorced, especially if one another of the spouses isn't supportive of your grief. We talked about this a little bit, but the circumstances and causes of the loss. So forgiveness. Forgiveness is an important piece of all of this. Because there may be the perception. And I say perception because I did an awful lot of blaming and there was nothing Roger could have done to change any of it. But the perception of the cause of the loss. Or the wish that you would have done something different, or they would have done something different, or we could have done this or that. And then it talks about coping skills, what kind of coping skills you had. So I believe I had good coping skills. I just want to put this out here. I'm a therapist. I tell people how to use coping skills. I journal. I do art. I have hobbies. I meditate. I do all of those things, which they consider to be coping skills. But it was a struggle. It was such a struggle. I was so destroyed that I didn't even consider my coping skills, especially at first. And cognitively, I feel like it affects your brain too. And they don't talk about this. So this study, this Compassionate Friends, they did this study. And I think they're headed by people that have grief. But my cognitive skills, while I was going through grief, especially in the beginning, were not there. I couldn't think. I couldn't form words. I struggled with communication and irritability. I went on antidepressants and I still struggled. It was a difficult time. And that's just something else too that maybe we'll get into in another podcast, is making sure during this time that you don't get diagnosed with a mental health disorder. I think we'll talk about that on a different episode, or I might have already talked about it. But coping skills. What I want to say about that is everybody has their own. So at the moment, do what you feel like doing, and that is a coping skill. Working in a garden, coping skill. The meaning of coping skill is anything that helps you deal with your feelings and helps you cope in the moment. I depend on music. I talk to myself quite a bit. I have a lot of self-talk. And this was a big one for me that I did not have. The amount of support received from people around you. And I really hope that there are other people out there that had more support than I had. But I didn't have much, especially in the beginning. And this goes back to what I want to say about this is the support wasn't there to begin with. So it might have been unrealistic to think that the support would be there after, and it just wasn't. And that was the most heartbreaking part of all of it. Because I thought I had some support. So there was a list of people, right? These are the people that support you. These are the people that don't. So I was surprised at the amount of people that moved from support you to don't support you. And in fact, I have 2 friends that survived the last 13 years with me. 2. And no family besides my immediate family, my son, his wife, and the grandkids. My dad is there physically, but he's not someone to support you emotionally. He just doesn't have that ability. So I hope there's other people out there that have more support than I did. And I hope you're receiving it. Relationship after the death of a child is, in mine and Roger's case, it's definitely brought us closer together. Our relationship is stronger after the fact. And I don't know that that has anything to do with anything except for there was never talk of divorce. We were too deep into grieving. We were too deep into just trying to survive to even consider divorce. So I just gotta wonder that the people that do get divorced after your child died, if there wasn't difficulty in the relationship beforehand. And honestly, I think part of the reason is too, is that people think it's easier, right? If I was alone, I could do what I wanted. I could grieve the way I wanted. And that's a factor too. I gotta tell you, that's a factor too. Because sometimes religious considerations come up or cultural, where one person believes this is the way to do it and the other person believes this is the way to do it, and they clash and don't come to an understanding of how to do that, and they get stuck in it's my way or the highway. And sometimes people have to leave just to be able to finish their grieving. What I want to end with is divorce is not automatic when you lose a child. The things that are broken in your relationship will be exposed. The things that you do well will be enhanced, and that ultimately a decision has to be made about whether or not you're going to stay together and work through this, or if it's better for you to go your separate ways. But I would really caution people that not to do a divorce in the middle of grief. The mental capacity to experience both, I think, would be really, really difficult. And I think about it for a couple of reasons. One, your identity. So when your child dies, your identity changes. And you have to figure out, who are you after the death of your child? What kind of person are you? What are your beliefs? You have to recreate that identity, and you recreate it from the ashes of the person you were. The other piece of that is when you get divorced, you also have to develop a new identity as who you are as a single person. And I don't know that that's any easier than developing your identity when you're grieving. But that's two losses on top of a major life-changing experience, and I just think it would be so much more difficult for people to do. So if at all possible, wait a few years. Wait till the active part of your grieving is over. And you will know when the time is. I would say listen to your heart and not listen to your mind. Because your mind might say, it's easier to get out. It's easier to get out. It may not necessarily be easier to get out. And then they recommend, I'd be amiss if I didn't recommend counseling. I just don't know how effective it would be unless you worked with someone that knew what it was like to be living with the death of a child. I have a counselor friend and I love her dearly. She loves marital therapy. And I think that what she would have a couple do is work on their relationship if they came in. What I would say about that is grieving is a solitary process. I wrote my book called The Solitary Journey Through the Loss of a Child. And I really believe that's a solitary journey. Everybody has to work that out inside their own heart and inside their own mind before they can reconnect with their partner. So the first task would be to work through your grief. And then work on forgiveness of self and forgiveness of your partner. I believe that it's a natural process to blame each other. Doesn't matter how they died. You'd blame each other because that's just how it is. And parents, your children are not supposed to die before you. That cultural belief of your child's not supposed to die before you is one of the things that most impact us as grieving parents. At least that's my belief. I struggled with that so much because I thought I was a bad mother because my son died. Even though I had absolutely no control of how he died, when he died, nothing. And also the lack of control. So I hope that this podcast was helpful in the respect that it can reassure you that just because you lost your child, that you're going to get divorced, that it takes work, that it'll seem like too much work at times, but in the end, it will be worth it. So this is Cristi Habermann signing off. Hopefully have a podcast out next week now that I'm back up to full strength, at least partially. I will go back to a regular podcasting schedule. Thanks for listening.